sermon comes from the Gospel according to Mark, in the 9th chapter, starting with the 14th verse. Just to give you a little bit of setting, this is at a time in Jesus' ministry where just a few days before, he'd asked the disciples who they thought he was. And for the first time, they began to recognize him as the Messiah, the Christ. And this incident that we're about to read happens as Jesus and John and Peter and James are coming down from the mountain where Jesus was transfigured in front of their eyes in a bright light. And they heard God speak, calling Jesus his son. As they're on the way down from the mountain, from that time, that moment, that revelation, this story happens. When they came to the disciples, they saw a great crowd around them, and some scribes arguing with them. When the whole crowd saw him, they were immediately overcome with awe, and they ran forward to greet Jesus. He asked them, "What are you arguing about with them?" Someone from the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought you my son. He has a spirit that makes him unable to speak, and whenever it seizes him, it dashes him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. And I asked your disciples to cast it out, but they could not do so." Jesus answered them, "You faithless generation, how much longer must I be with you? Bring him to me." And they brought the boy to him. When the spirit saw Jesus, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked the father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And the father said, "From childhood. It has often cast him into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you're able to do anything, have pity on us and help us." Jesus said to him, "If you are able, all things can be done for the one who believes." And immediately the father of the child cried out, "I believe. Help my unbelief." When Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "You spirit that keeps this boy from speaking and hearing, I command you, come out of him, and never enter him again." After crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out. And the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them there thought he was dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he was able to stand. And when he had entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, "Why could we not cast it out?" And he said to them, "This kind can come out only through prayer and fasting." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So this starts as a story about healing and prayer, but I'm going to use it to talk about fasting as an aid to prayer. This is an interesting story. Of course, I have a lot of sympathy for it, because the boy in question almost certainly has epilepsy, as my daughter does, and indeed as I do, although I'm lucky. I've been treated with medication. I haven't had a seizure since 1989. But these symptoms, they're just exactly like the symptoms of epilepsy. And I just want to touch on a small point as we pass, because this is also an exorcism, a removal of a demon possession. And maybe sometime we'll have a teaching about this, but just briefly, I want to remind us that sometimes the things that the evil one does to us overlap with things that are wrong with us physically and mentally. So that in this case, I'm sure that in one sense this boy had epilepsy, the neurological disease and was also healed of that disease at this time. But also, the evil one was using that disease to torment him. This frequently happens, that things overlap. Some people have a gene that makes it easy for them to become alcoholics. And even though it's partly their fault, because if they'd never drank in the first place, they never would have become alcoholics. Nonetheless, it's also the case that the evil one uses that to torment us and twist our lives. Otherwise, if that was all there was to it, it would be possible for most alcoholics to be like a fella named Bill Bell that I once knew. Bill was a plumber and a pipe fitter. And he would stay sober for 6 months, working at plumbing and pipe fitting. He was working building nuclear power plants. And then when he piled up enough money, he'd quit work and he'd start drinking. And for 6 months, he'd drink a bottle of whiskey every single day. Spread out through the day. And he was perfectly charming, kind, quiet, no harm to anyone, relaxed. And eventually he'd go back to work again. He'd been doing this every year since the end of World War II, where he'd served as a soldier. And I knew him in 1975. If it was only the physical thing, if it was only epilepsy, if it was only the alcoholic gene, then maybe it would be as quiet and gentle as that, just something to cope with. But the evil one takes advantage of these things and makes them worse and causes them to ruin our lives. And that's what's happening to this boy. And I look at what the Father says. Later we'll talk about answers to prayer. And we'll talk about things like Jesus saying, if you believe, if you've got even as much faith as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, rise up and be cast into the sea. But Jesus starts on that now. He says, if you believe, this can be done for you. And the Father says, I believe. Otherwise, I wouldn't have brought my son here. Here I am. I believe. Help me because I also don't believe. Because I doubt it. Because I'm worried that nothing will happen. I think that's the position most of us are in, most of our lives long. We do believe, otherwise we wouldn't be here. And we need help. Sometimes our prayers need help, and in certain cases, fasting is a strong help to prayer. Linda, my wife, Linda and I have some good friends. These good friends live in Germany now. He's a professor of New Testament. And they have 3 children. We stood up with 2 of those children when they were dedicated as youngsters. And the eldest child, a daughter, has a bad mental illness. First of all, it manifested itself as a learning disability when she was growing up. And now it's a lot like schizophrenia. She doesn't really understand what's going on around her. She has these crazy ideas that boys that she's merely writing to on the internet and just a little bit are actually terribly in love with her. She usually doesn't live anywhere special, but on the streets and in homeless shelters. She can take medication for it, which helps when she takes it, but she doesn't like it because the medication makes her gain weight, and also because the medication slows down her mental processes a little bit. When she doesn't take it, her mind runs at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and it's crazy, but it's also exciting and fun. So she frequently quits taking her medication, and then she ends up on the streets. Sometimes she ends up arrested. Sometimes she ends up in the hospital, at the emergency room, because things have gotten too bad. We had her come live with us for 4 months some years ago, and noticed what was going on at a time when it wasn't as bad as it is now. And she's a difficult person to live with. My wife Linda fasts in order to pray for her 3 or 4 times a month. Fast for a whole day, 3 or 4 times a month, just to pray for her. And has been doing that for 2 or 3 years now. situations like this that go on and on, that are terrible and that are continuing and that seem to persist. This kind comes out only through prayer and fasting, Jesus says. Tough ones are times when sometimes we need to use fasting to help us with our prayers. Linda does that. Sometimes things get a little better. Last year, Daniela actually accepted baptism and professed faith and spent almost 6 months living with her grandmother and keeping her life in some small order. She stopped taking her medication again and later was back out on the street. Now she's living with a cousin, briefly. We hope that continues. But my wife continues her discipline of fasting in order to dedicate herself to prayer for Daniela. Daniela is our godchild. If her parents had been killed, those children would have come to us for us to raise them. We aren't just Christians to enjoy the benefits. We aren't just Christians to relieve our consciences of the guilt of sin and to enjoy being saved. We aren't just Christians to have a good time in fellowship and at worship. We're also Christians to be disciples, to follow Jesus, to become like Jesus, to do the things that Jesus did. And this means that we need to practice discipleship. And discipleship is discipline. And there are spiritual disciplines. Just like there are educational disciplines when you study a new language, or when you study math, or when you study history. Just like there are disciplines when you learn a sport, when you drill at simple skills over and over again until they become automatic so that you can move on to different skills, so also there are spiritual disciplines. And prayer is one of them, and fasting is another. Some points about fasting. Fasting usually means abstaining from all food for at least a day at a time. Usually you don't abstain from water because your body needs water a lot. Some fasters abstain from water. You can get away with that for a day or so, but not for much longer. You can fast from food for 3 consecutive days and do no harm to yourself whatsoever, unless you're already sick or already starving. You can probably fast for at least 3 weeks without doing any harm to yourself whatsoever, because most of us here in America carry 10 or 15 pounds of extra fat, and that fat is exactly what your body uses to burn for energy when you're fasting. So fasting is not particularly dangerous, especially not as a spiritual practice used in the short term. Fasting for 40 days is running on the edge of death. But 3 days is no effect to speak of at all. And 1 day is nothing more than uncomfortable, irritating, bothersome, and it requires an act of will. It requires an act of will, and that means that it is a spiritual exercise. Your body is automatically programmed to go get food. Your body is automatically programmed to eat that food. And if you're sitting around not thinking, you'll grab a snack, you'll eat while watching television, you won't skip meals. It's automatic. If you don't think about it, if you don't exert your will, you're going to eat. In order to fast for more than 3 or 4 hours, in order to fast for more than 6 hours, even if you're busy doing something exciting that distracts you, in order to fast for a whole day, you have to exert your will. It's a choice that you have to make. It's a choice that you have to make probably 15 or 20 times during the day. Because that automated programming in your brain, connected to your stomach, and the mechanism that samples your blood sugar, that automatic mechanism is going to say, go get something to eat. Go on, go get something to eat. There's something in the refrigerator. There's chips in the cabinet. It's automated. 15 to 20 times a day, you're going to have to say, there it is again. I'm not going to do that. And that moment of exerting your will is also the moment when you turn to prayer. It's a reminder for prayer. It's an indicator that now it's time to pray again about the thing that you're praying about, that you're fasting about. The spiritual exercise of not eating is now strengthening you for prayer. Because the truth of the matter is that most of us, if we say, okay, I'll pray about that to someone, a friend, we might pray about it once a day for 3 sentences in the course of our daily prayers. And that's okay. We mean that honestly and seriously. But in truth, that's about how much we usually pray about stuff, isn't it? I know it is for me, and I've talked to people and they've said, yeah, that's about how it works. Or sometimes it only gets prayed about 3 or 4 times a week, but maybe we get a little more attention then. The serious subjects, the ones that trouble us over and over again, the ones that won't go away, are the ones we need to pray about more seriously, more frequently, more deeply. And the spiritual exercise of fasting serves as an aid to prayer in cases like that. That's what it's for. That's how it's used. Now, when Jesus was walking among us, the Pharisees came to him and said, look, we fast. We fast every week. Your disciples aren't fasting. They never fast. Does that mean they're not very worshipful? That they're not very spiritual? And Jesus said to them, look, as long as the bridegroom is at a party, you don't fast in the middle of a party. You don't go to Jack's wedding and skip the meal. A wedding is a celebration. Well, as long as I'm here on earth, this is a celebration. But when I'm gone, my disciples will fast. But Jesus also, in another place, talked to the Pharisees about their practice of fasting. He said, look, when you fast, don't be a hypocrite. Don't make a public thing about it. Don't draw a sad face. Don't wear clothes that proclaim this guy is fasting. Don't make a sad look on your face. When you do that, you're just showing off. When you do that, you're just saying, hey, I'm fasting to prove how holy I am. Jesus said, no. He said, when you fast, do it in secret. Be cheerful. Laugh. Dress in your nicest clothes. Go out and talk to people. Hide the fact that you're exercising this discipline so that you don't get trapped into showing off. So that the only purpose that's left for this discipline is to become stronger in spirit and to dedicate that strength of spirit to prayer. To prayer. We need spiritual disciplines and spiritual exercises. We are here to become disciples, to become like Jesus, to follow Jesus, to do what Jesus does. And that's work. And that takes preparation. And that takes intentional choices about what we're going to do, how we're going to spend our time, what we're not going to do, and how we're going to go about doing the things we share with one another. Those choices will be improved if we do spiritual exercises. There are other spiritual exercises. Prayer itself is a spiritual exercise. Reading Scripture is a spiritual exercise. Fellowship is partly a spiritual exercise and partly the enjoyment of what God has given us. Fasting is a spiritual exercise. Giving is a spiritual exercise. But I'm not talking about that now. Maybe I'll talk about that in the season when we talk about stewardship. Giving is a spiritual exercise too. Anything that forces us to exert our will against our natural tendencies in order to do what God has called us to do is a spiritual exercise. It makes us more like who we truly are. it makes us more like who God wants us to be. It gives us strength and skill and spiritual skill to shape our lives the way we want. Spirit is tricky. It's difficult sometimes to know exactly what spirit is. In one place Jesus says the Spirit is like the wind. You don't know where it comes from, you don't know where it's going, but you can feel it moving. But just as a rule of thumb, spirit is will, choice, decision, action, thought, feeling. These things are all actions of the Spirit rather than of the flesh. That's just a rule of thumb. And if you get into a philosophy class in college or you start thinking about it for hours at a time, you'll have to come up with something more sophisticated, more careful. But as a rule of thumb, it's pretty good. Nature and the flesh are the things that are what they are because that's what they must be. You must get hungry. It's programmed into you. You must suffer from sexual desire. It's programmed into you. You must drink water. The things that must be the way they are by nature, that's the flesh, that's matter, that's the world. The things that spring from choice, thought, feeling, decision, those actions, those are the spiritual things. And it's not automatically the case that spiritual things are good and fleshly things are bad. There are bad spiritual things too. The affliction to which the evil one puts this boy who has epilepsy, casting him into the fire, ruining his relationship with others, impeding his ability to function so that he can't talk or hear with other people, not just suffer seizures. Spiritual things can be bad as well as good. Now, one of the things that we need to exercise spiritual discipline about is something that used to be called besetting sins. And besetting sin, you ever heard that phrase? Anyone? Well, that's because none of you are more than 100 years old. It used to be a common phrase for a long time, especially in manuals of pastoral care that were given to ministers. A besetting sin is a sin that you can't get rid of. A besetting sin is a sin that you keep suffering from over and over again, even though you've prayed about it, even though you've confessed it, even though you've gone and made amends for it from time to time. A besetting sin is one that besets you, that grabs you, that keeps grabbing a hold of you over and over again. Does that make sense now? You have sins that are like that. Some sins you commit, it's an act. You realize later how bad it was. You confess it. You make amends to the people you hurt. And it's over. It was a point action. It was a certain time. Sometimes these are the more serious ones. But other ones are sins that come back to you again and again and again and again. And sometimes you get a season when they go away, and then they come back again. Besetting sins are the kinds of things that sometimes it helps to use fasting with as an aid to prayer, as a reminder to prayer. We went on a mission trip to North Carolina. Is only a week ago? Feels like we've been back longer than that. Now, I like words. I like to play with words. I think of words as things in a game I'm playing with, like you think of a basketball or a baseball or something like that. And I like dumb little facts and bits of history. I play with them like you would play with a sketch pad or play with your guitar. They're just plain fun. And I think that's all right. And I try to encourage people to laugh at me for it, because otherwise I can get to be a bit of a pain in the tail. So I'm on the mission trip. We're sitting around the house where we work, I didn't put any pictures of the house in there. We're sitting around the house where we spend our evenings. And one evening we're sitting there, the tables are spread out, people are playing games or reading or doing other things. I'm sitting at my computer, I'm sending emails, I'm doing bits of business for Presbytery back home. I was actually planning part of this sermon and also doing stuff for worship this week and in the weeks to come. And while I'm doing that, some people over the other table are playing a game of Scattergories. Was that it, Scattergories? Do y'all know what Scattergories are? Some of you do, some of you don't. You have categories and you try to think of words, names of things that fit into those categories. And while they're playing that, sometimes a question comes up. Is this word of that? Are the things that are called this, do they fit into that category of something? And casually and carelessly, I would look up and say, no, that's a such and such. That's what that word means. Or later, it would be, no, that's how this category works. Let me tell you this little story about how it got that way. And then go back to my stuff and look at it. I'm acting like a referee. I wasn't even playing the game with them. I'm acting like a teacher. I'm giving little small lectures. I'm not even in the game with them. And it's a game to me because I grew up thinking facts were fun and words were fun. And every little thing you can do with them is, oh, hey, man, everyone wants to know what a word means when they hear it and they don't know it, right? Everyone wants to hear a little story out of philosophy or history that illuminates any little thing they think about, don't they? Don't they? I mean, I do. So I'm sitting there carelessly dropping these stories on them or correcting these uses of language and not even noticing that I'm being a pain in the tail. That I sound like a teacher in a class. That we're playing a game. This isn't even a lesson. I played the game earlier in the evening before I went aside to work on my email. And the sin here is not for me to play with words and ideas and little bits of history. The sin is not paying attention to the people I'm doing it with. Not paying attention to the fact that they might be different than me. Not paying attention to how what I'm doing sounds to them. Not even thinking of it. It's a besetting sin. I've been struggling with it since I was younger than Aaron. I do this with dumb little math facts too. I try to get people to laugh at math facts when I do those, and sometimes they do. But if I'm not paying attention, I do it too much, and I do it too carelessly, and I do it from off on the side. So it sounds like I'm lecturing or teaching or just being an adult. The sin is not paying attention to the people around me. And as I say, I've been struggling with it for a long time. So earlier in this week, I spent a day praying and fasting about it. Because I was reminded of it this last week at the mission trip and decided, whoops, I need to get back on that one again. I haven't been taking care of that one for a while. It's time to get back to it. And I don't fast as often as my wife does. I don't fast more than 9 or 10 times a year, not 2 or 3 times a month like she does. So I find it really difficult and really irritating. I get hungry, not for the first 3 hours of the day when I first get up, but after that, every hour, on the hour, every half hour, sometimes when it gets late, just a continuous, there's food in the house. There's food in the house. It's right there. I wouldn't have to walk 6 steps to get the food. And my brain, cooperating with my body, wants me to go eat. And that's when I not only have to exert my will, that's when I remind myself again, look, you got to pay attention to the people around you. Look, other people don't think the way you do. Look, you're here for them, not for your own play. Look, pay attention. Pay attention. And to praying. This is one of the chief uses of fasting. to force us to have a day when we pray about something over and over and over and over again. To build a different pattern of thinking and feeling and choosing and acting. Sometimes also, fasting is an aid to prayer when we're suffering from a period of spiritual oppression. I don't know about you, but sometimes, not often, but 2 or 3 times a year, I may go through a period that's sort of like depression. It usually only lasts 1 to 3 days. But something about the way life is, something about what's going on in it. Maybe the fact that my daughter has this seizure disorder